You are sitting on the edge of your bed at 2 in the morning, staring into the dark, replaying the same conversation you have had with yourself 100 times before. You remember the nights when you begged for something to change. You remember asking for relief when your chest felt heavy, asking for answers when everything seemed uncertain, asking for a sign when silence was the only thing that answered back. And yet something strange happened. Life moved forward anyway. Some problems disappeared, some fears faded. Some situations resolved themselves, some opportunities appeared, some disasters never arrived, and because the timing felt meaningful, because the emotional weight was so intense, because the outcome mattered so much to you, a question quietly settled into your mind without you noticing. Maybe the prayer worked, but what if the more uncomfortable possibility is not that prayer failed, and not even that prayer succeeded, but that you never stopped to examine what actually happened between the moment you asked and the moment things changed. Human beings are storytelling creatures. We cannot tolerate randomness for very long. We search for causes. We connect dots. We create narratives. We build explanations that help transform uncertainty into something manageable. When something painful happens, we ask why. When something beautiful happens, we ask why. When something improbable happens, we ask why. The need is almost irresistible. The alternative is standing face to face with a universe that often refuses to explain itself. And that uncertainty can feel unbearable. Imagine a person who desperately wants a specific job. They spend weeks praying for it. They visualize it. They hope for it. They fear not getting it. Eventually they receive the offer. Instantly the story writes itself. The prayer worked. But notice how rarely people pause to examine the dozens of invisible factors involved, the qualifications accumulated over years, the interview preparation, the decisions made by strangers, the economic conditions, the timing, the competition, the luck. The countless variables no one can fully measure. The human mind often rushes past complexity because complexity does not provide emotional closure. A simple explanation feels better, it feels cleaner, it feels more satisfying. Yet satisfaction and truth are not always the same thing. This is where the discomfort begins. Because if you start questioning one explanation, you may find yourself questioning many explanations, and that can feel threatening. Not because you lose certainty, but because certainty often functions like emotional protection. Certainty tells you the world makes sense. Certainty tells you there is a clear relationship between effort and outcome, between asking and receiving, between suffering and reward. But life frequently behaves in ways that refuse such neat formulas. Think about the prayers that seemed unanswered, the ones that never became testimonies, the ones nobody posts about, the ones nobody celebrates, the child who never recovered, the relationship that still ended, the financial collapse that still happened, the loneliness that remained, the fear that stayed, the uncertainty that lingered. Human memory has a fascinating tendency. It highlights successes and quietly buries failures. We remember the times reality aligned with our hopes. We forget the times it did not because we are dishonest, but because our minds are constantly editing experience into a coherent story. Psychologists sometimes describe this tendency as a way of preserving meaning. We notice evidence that supports our beliefs more easily than evidence that challenges them. We are not machines processing information objectively. We are emotional beings navigating existence through narratives, and those narratives become part of our identity. This is why questioning them can feel deeply personal. The topic is larger than prayer. It touches something fundamental about being human. We want to believe our actions matter. We want to believe our hopes matter. We want to believe our suffering is not meaningless. We want to believe there is a connection between our inner world and the events unfolding around us. Prayer often becomes a vessel for those desires. But what if part of its power was never located in changing the external world? What if part of its power emerged from changing the person doing the praying? Consider what happens psychologically when someone prays. They slow down, they focus attention. They organize thoughts, they articulate fears, they clarify desires, they process emotions. They create moments of reflection that might not otherwise exist. In many cases, they become calmer, they become more patient, They become more resilient. They become more willing to continue despite uncertainty. And when those internal shifts influence future decisions, behaviors, and attitudes, outcomes can change, not necessarily because reality was altered by a supernatural intervention, but because the individual was altered by the act itself. Yet even that interpretation remains incomplete. Human existence rarely submits to a single explanation. There are experiences that feel impossible to reduce to psychology alone. There are coincidences that feel uncanny. There are moments of timing that leave people speechless. There are stories that resist easy categorization. The deeper question may not be whether prayer works or does not work. The deeper question may be why human beings are so eager to arrive at definitive conclusions about things that exist at the edge of mystery. Maybe certainty itself is the thing we are really chasing. Maybe the desire for certainty explains more than we realize, because uncertainty is exhausting. Imagine admitting that you do not fully know why something happened. Imagine admitting that you cannot prove whether a specific outcome emerged from prayer, chance, effort, timing, psychology, circumstance, or some combination of factors too complex to untangle. That admission can feel deeply unsatisfying, yet it may also be more honest. There is another layer to this conversation that many people avoid because it feels uncomfortable. Sometimes prayer can become a substitute for action. Not always, but sometimes. Sometimes a person spends years waiting for a miracle while avoiding difficult decisions. Sometimes they ask for confidence instead of confronting fear. Sometimes they ask for change while protecting the habits that maintain their suffering. Sometimes they ask for rescue while refusing responsibility. And then something even stranger happens. When progress eventually occurs, they attribute it entirely to the prayer and overlook the moments when they finally acted differently. They overlook the conversations they initiated. They overlook the risks they took. They overlook the boundaries they established. They overlook the skills they developed. They overlook the courage they found. They overlook themselves. This may be one of the most overlooked psychological patterns in human life. People often underestimate their own role in their transformation. They look at the finish line and forget the thousands of choices that carried them there. Perhaps one reason this topic provokes such strong emotions is because it forces us to confront a difficult possibility. What if some of the strength you attributed to an external source was also present within you? What if some of the resilience you celebrated was yours? What if some of the wisdom you discovered emerged through your own growth? What if some of the answers arrived because you became capable of recognizing them? None of these questions require rejecting faith. None require accepting faith. They simply require honesty. And honesty is often more unsettling than disbelief, because honesty removes easy answers. Honesty forces us to sit with complexity. Honesty asks us to acknowledge how little we truly understand about consciousness, meaning, coincidence, suffering, hope, and the strange relationship between expectation and perception. The person staring into the darkness at 2 a.m. is not merely asking whether prayer works. They are asking something much deeper. They are asking whether their life has meaning. They are asking whether their pain matters. They are asking whether anyone is listening. They are asking whether hope is rational. They are asking whether they can trust the future. These questions have followed humanity for thousands of years. They appear in every culture, every generation, every era. And perhaps that persistence reveals something important. The need behind prayer may be just as significant as the answers people believe they receive from it, because beneath every request lies vulnerability. Beneath every plea lies uncertainty. Beneath every hope lies fear. And beneath every fear lies the same uncomfortable reality that connects all human beings. None of us fully knows what is happening. We construct meanings. We search for patterns. We interpret experiences. We build stories. We navigate mystery. And perhaps the most unsettling realization of all is not that prayer never worked. It is that you may never be able to separate with complete certainty what changed because of prayer, what changed because of you, what changed because of circumstances, and what changed because life unfolded in ways nobody could have predicted. That uncertainty does not end the conversation. It begins it. The moment becomes even more uncomfortable when you realize how much of your life has been shaped by interpretations rather than facts. Think about how many times you looked backward and assigned meaning to events only after they happened. A relationship ends and years later you call it necessary. A rejection hurts and eventually you call it protection. A failure devastates you and later you call it preparation. The event itself did not arrive carrying a label. The meaning was created afterward. Human beings are experts at retroactive storytelling. We look into the chaos of life and arrange the pieces into patterns that help us survive emotionally. This is not necessarily deception. It is how consciousness works. We are constantly transforming experience into narrative because narrative gives suffering structure. Without structure, pain feels random. And random pain is one of the hardest realities for the human mind to accept. Now consider what happens when prayer enters that process. A person prays desperately for guidance. Months pass. Nothing obvious changes. Then one day a decision becomes clear. Perhaps they finally leave a toxic relationship. Perhaps they finally confront an addiction. Perhaps they finally choose a new direction. Looking back, the story becomes obvious. The prayer was answered. But was it? Or was something more complicated happening beneath the surface? During those months, the person was thinking constantly, reflecting constantly, wrestling with fear constantly, evaluating possibilities constantly. The prayer may have been part of a larger psychological process that gradually transformed confusion into clarity. Yet because the transformation occurred slowly, invisibly, and emotionally, it feels as though the answer arrived from outside rather than emerging from within. Again, this does not prove one interpretation and disprove another. It simply reveals how difficult it is to separate them. The human mind craves clean explanations for experiences that are rarely clean. There is another uncomfortable truth hiding beneath this discussion. Many people do not pray because they are certain. They pray because they are uncertain. They pray because uncertainty hurts. They pray because they are afraid. They pray because they are overwhelmed. They pray because they are standing in front of a future they cannot control. This means that prayer often serves a psychological function long before any outcome occurs. It provides emotional regulation in situations where control is limited or non-existent. Imagine sitting beside a hospital bed. Imagine waiting for medical results. Imagine watching a loved one suffer. Imagine facing bankruptcy. Imagine confronting grief. In moments like these, action can feel impossible. The future becomes inaccessible. Control evaporates. Human beings are not designed to tolerate complete helplessness very well. We search desperately for something we can still do. Prayer can become that thing. It offers participation when participation feels impossible. It offers movement when circumstances seem frozen. It offers a sense of connection when isolation becomes overwhelming. Even people who question whether anyone is listening often continue speaking because the act itself eases something inside them. But here is where the tension deepens. If prayer provides emotional comfort, does that automatically mean its effectiveness lies only within psychology? Not necessarily. And this is where many conversations become polarized. One side insists every outcome proves divine involvement. Another side insists every outcome can be explained entirely through psychology, coincidence, and natural processes. Yet reality often refuses to fit comfortably inside ideological extremes. Human experience is messier than that, much messier. The deeper issue may not be whether prayer changes reality. The deeper issue may be how human beings interpret reality after it changes. Because interpretation is never neutral. Two people can experience the same event and reach entirely different conclusions. One person sees a miracle, another sees probability. One sees divine timing, another sees coincidence. One sees intervention, another sees psychological adaptation. The event remains the same. The story changes. And stories possess extraordinary power. Stories determine how people understand their lives. Stories influence future decisions. Stories shape identities. Stories affect emotional resilience. Stories influence hope. The narrative someone adopts can alter the way they move through the world for years. Perhaps this is why questioning stories feels so threatening. You are not merely questioning an explanation. You are questioning a framework through which someone understands existence itself. And when existence feels fragile, people often cling to frameworks with remarkable intensity. Consider the moments when prayer appears to fail completely. These are often the experiences that receive the least public attention because they create tension that is difficult to resolve. A person prays with absolute sincerity. Nothing changes. They pray again. Nothing changes. They wait. Nothing changes. The desired outcome never arrives. Now they face a painful choice. Either they must question the effectiveness of prayer, question their interpretation of prayer, question themselves, or accept uncertainty. For many people, uncertainty is the hardest option because uncertainty refuses closure. It leaves the question open. It leaves the wound exposed. It leaves the mystery unresolved. Yet perhaps there is something strangely mature about accepting unresolved questions. Modern culture often treats certainty as a virtue. People rush to conclusions. They demand definitive answers. They want black and white explanations for experiences that exist in shades of grey. But adulthood frequently involves learning how to live with ambiguity. The older many people become, the more they realize that life contains far fewer certainties than they once imagined. Love is uncertain. Success is uncertain. Health is uncertain. Relationships are uncertain. The future is uncertain. Even our memories are less reliable than we like to believe. Research repeatedly demonstrates how easily memory can be reshaped, edited, and reconstructed. We do not remember experiences exactly as they happened. We remember interpretations of experiences. Then we remember interpretations of those interpretations. Over time, the story becomes inseparable from the event itself. This matters because many beliefs about prayer are built upon memories. People remember what happened. They remember how they felt. They remember the timing. They remember the outcome. Yet the human mind naturally organizes these memories into coherent narratives. Coherence feels true. But feeling true and being objectively demonstrable are not identical things. This realization can feel deeply unsettling because it challenges one of the assumptions many people carry throughout life. The assumption that their interpretations are transparent windows into reality. What if they are not? What if every person is navigating existence through layers of perception, emotion, expectation, memory, and meaning-making? What if the story you tell yourself about your life is only one possible interpretation among many? Suddenly, the conversation becomes much larger than prayer. It becomes a conversation about consciousness itself, about how human beings construct reality, about how meaning emerges, about why people believe what they believe, about how fear and hope influence perception, about how desperately we seek certainty in a world that rarely provides it. And perhaps nowhere is this struggle more visible than in moments of suffering. Suffering has a way of stripping away illusions. It exposes what people truly believe. It reveals what they cling to when comfort disappears. When life is easy, philosophical questions often remain abstract. When life hurts, those same questions become urgent. A person facing profound loss is not conducting an intellectual exercise. They are searching for something capable of carrying emotional weight. They are searching for meaning strong enough to survive reality. This may explain why debates about prayer often become emotionally charged. They are rarely just debates about prayer. Beneath the surface are questions about grief, mortality, hope, loneliness, fear, justice, purpose, and the possibility that existence contains significance beyond what can be measured. These questions touch something ancient within the human psyche, something vulnerable, something deeply personal. And perhaps that is why simplistic answers often feel inadequate, because the human condition itself is not simple. You can spend years examining psychology, philosophy, neuroscience, religion, history, and human behavior, and still find yourself staring at the ceiling late at night asking the same questions people have asked for centuries. Why am I here? Why do I suffer? What gives life meaning? Can hope be trusted? Is anyone listening? The remarkable thing is that these questions persist even when answers remain elusive. Human beings continue searching, continue hoping, continue interpreting, continue building stories, continue finding significance in experiences, continue wrestling with uncertainty. Maybe that persistence reveals something important. Maybe the search itself matters more than many people realize. Maybe the act of asking shapes us as much as any answer ever could. And maybe the most uncomfortable possibility is not that prayer never worked. Maybe the most uncomfortable possibility is that you have spent years looking outward for explanations, while overlooking the extraordinary complexity unfolding inside your own mind, where fear becomes hope, uncertainty becomes narrative, and meaning emerges from the endless conversation between reality and the stories you tell yourself about it. Eventually, you arrive at a place most people spend their entire lives trying to avoid, not because it is dangerous, but because it is deeply uncomfortable. It is the place where easy certainty begins to dissolve, the place where you can no longer confidently separate what came from the world, what came from your beliefs, what came from your effort, what came from chance, and what came from the countless invisible forces that shape every human life. Most people do not notice how desperately they want a clear formula for existence. Do the right things, and good things will happen. Ask, and you will receive. Work hard, and you will succeed. Be patient, and you will be rewarded. Suffer now, and it will all make sense later. These formulas are emotionally attractive because they transform reality into something predictable. They suggest that life operates according to understandable rules. They reduce uncertainty. They create order, but then reality interrupts. A good person suffers, a careful person fails, a selfish person succeeds, a dream collapses despite years of dedication, a tragedy strikes without warning, a miracle seems to happen where no one expected it. Suddenly the formula cracks. Suddenly life looks far less predictable than we wanted it to be, and this is where many people experience a quiet internal crisis. Not necessarily a crisis of faith, not necessarily a crisis of disbelief, a crisis of certainty. They begin to realize that existence may be far more complicated than the narratives they inherited. They begin to see that every worldview contains unanswered questions. Every philosophy encounters mysteries. Every belief system eventually reaches the edge of what it can explain. Some people respond by doubling down on certainty. Others respond by abandoning certainty altogether. But there is another possibility, a more difficult possibility, the possibility of learning how to live honestly inside uncertainty without allowing uncertainty to destroy hope. This is harder than it sounds. Human beings are naturally drawn toward conclusions. We want final answers. We want permanent closure. We want confidence that our interpretation is correct. Yet some of the most important questions in life may never offer that kind of resolution. You may never know with absolute certainty why one opportunity appeared and another disappeared. You may never know why certain people entered your life and others left. You may never know why one moment changed everything while another seemed meaningless. You may never know whether a specific prayer altered reality, altered you, or simply became woven into a larger story that only makes sense in retrospect. And perhaps that realization feels disappointing at first because certainty can be comforting. But something unexpected often happens when certainty loosens its grip. Curiosity begins to grow. Humility begins to grow. Compassion begins to grow. You become less interested in proving and more interested in understanding, less interested in defending and more interested in exploring, less interested in forcing conclusions and more interested in observing reality honestly. This shift changes the way you see yourself. It changes the way you see other people. Suddenly you realize that everyone is carrying invisible questions. Everyone is constructing meaning from incomplete information. Everyone is trying to navigate fear, lost desire, hope, loneliness, disappointment, and mortality. The person who believes differently than you is often wrestling with the same human vulnerabilities beneath a different set of conclusions. The person who interprets prayer differently is often responding to the same emotional needs through a different narrative. The details vary. The human condition remains surprisingly similar. And maybe this is where the conversation becomes most interesting, because the original question was never really about prayer. Not entirely. The original question hides a deeper question beneath it. Why do human beings need to believe that their experiences mean something? Why are we so uncomfortable with randomness? Why do we search so relentlessly for patterns? Why do we transform events into stories? Why do we look backward and connect dots that once seemed unrelated? Why does meaning matter so much to us? These questions point towards something profound. Human beings do not merely experience reality, they interpret reality. We live inside stories as much as we live inside circumstances. Two people can endure the same hardship and emerge with completely different understandings of what happened. One becomes bitter, one becomes grateful, one sees punishment, one sees growth, one sees abandonment, one sees transformation. The event remains unchanged. The meaning changes everything. This does not mean meaning is fake. It means meaning is powerful. It shapes perception. It shapes identity. It shapes emotional resilience. It shapes the future. And perhaps this is why the act of prayer remains significant, regardless of how one interprets its mechanisms. Because at its core, prayer often represents something deeply human. It represents the refusal to surrender completely to despair. It represents the attempt to reach beyond present suffering. It represents the desire for connection when isolation becomes overwhelming. It represents the search for meaning in situations that feel meaningless. It represents hope, confronting uncertainty. Even people who question whether prayer changes the external world cannot easily dismiss the role it plays within the internal world. Human beings require ways to process fear, ways to confront mortality, ways to articulate longing, ways to survive uncertainty. Prayer has served that function for countless individuals across cultures and generations. But perhaps the uncomfortable truth hiding beneath this entire discussion is not that prayer never worked. Perhaps the uncomfortable truth is that you may have underestimated yourself. Think about all the moments you survived that once seemed impossible. Think about all the nights you believed you would never recover. Think about all the disappointments that felt permanent. Think about all the fears that convinced you the future was hopeless. You are still here, not because you controlled everything, not because you understood everything, not because life was fair, but because something inside you kept moving forward. Maybe prayer accompanied that journey. Maybe reflection accompanied that journey. Maybe faith accompanied that journey. Maybe doubt accompanied that journey. Maybe all of them did. Yet somewhere along the way you adapted. You endured. You learned. You changed. You became someone capable of carrying experiences that once would have broken you. And perhaps that transformation deserves more attention than it usually receives. Because many people spend years searching for evidence that something outside them is powerful, while overlooking evidence that they themselves have changed in extraordinary ways. They forget how much courage was required. They forget how many difficult choices they made. They forget how many painful truths they faced. They forget how many times they continued despite uncertainty. They forget themselves. There is a strange irony in the human search for meaning. We often stare so intensely at distant explanations that we miss the transformation occurring directly in front of us. We become fascinated by the mystery outside while ignoring the mystery inside. Yet consciousness itself remains one of the greatest mysteries of all, the ability to hope despite suffering, the ability to love despite loss, the ability to continue despite fear, the ability to create meaning despite uncertainty. These capacities are extraordinary, whether one views them through a religious lens, a philosophical lens, a psychological lens, or some combination of all three. And perhaps that is where this reflection ultimately arrives, not at certainty, not at proof, not at a final answer that settles every question forever. It arrives at humility. The humility to admit that human beings understand far less than they often pretend. The humility to acknowledge that reality may be more complex than any single explanation. The humility to recognize that mystery remains even after arguments end. You may continue believing prayer changes the world. You may conclude that prayer primarily changes the person who prays. You may remain uncertain. You may move between interpretations throughout your life. What matters is not arriving at the most confident conclusion. What matters is remaining honest about the questions. Because honest questions often lead to deeper understanding than confident answers. And maybe that is the final uncomfortable realization. The greatest mystery was never whether prayer worked. The greatest mystery was why human beings need meaning so desperately, why uncertainty frightens them so deeply, why hope survives despite disappointment, and why even after countless unanswered questions, people continue searching, continue wondering, Continue reaching into the darkness, looking for understanding. Continue telling stories about their lives. Continue trying to make sense of existence. Continue hoping that somehow, in ways they may never fully understand, their struggles matter, their experiences matter, and their lives mean something. And perhaps the fact that this search never truly ends says more about being human than any answer ever could.